Thank you very much, right? I'll try to overcome the how overwhelmed I am by that presentation. First of all, by thanking the RCC, the staff, the students, and the other fellows for creating this unbelievably creative and stimulating place for thinking and writing, where I've learned too much to be explained. So yeah, as I told you, all my professional life, I have dwelt at the boundary between environmental governance or practice, or research for practice, and academia, and between natural sciences, social sciences, humanities. So you could say, as you already said, that I'm a boundary person from many points of view, and now I am looking at boundaries, more precisely at boundaries in maps. So, what you see in this map is a representation of Colombian páramos. Páramos are cold equatorial ecosystems that exist exclusively almost in Colombia, on the upper part of cordilleras, above 3,000 meters approximately. And I will tell you more in detail later, but they occupy about 2,900,000 hectares. That's more or less the size of Belgium, but distributed all along Colombia. And but of course, as you know, those shapes, those neat lines in the map are not páramos. They are they are conventions that are drawn with a purpose on very complex places of encounter between ecosystems and between different worlds and between different understandings of the world. And these particular páramos, these particular maps are also quite powerful maps, because according to the legal framework in Colombia since 2011, it's forbidden to do mining or agriculture inside páramos. So these lines are expected to affect people's lives and landscapes. Before coming to Munich, I was working for almost 3 years in a project whose task was to inform the Ministry of the Environment about this process of delimitation. I was working with the National Institute for Biodiversity Research, and we had to, in general terms, our task was to draw more precise maps at a better scale so that the law could be implemented, and to do recommendations for governance. I will later tell you more precisely what that is. So first, I will show you some of the complexity of páramos. Then I will try to show you how these lines came into being, which is actually my research question while I'm here. I'm trying to step back from that role as a policymaker, informing policymakers, and more trying to figure out what happened there, how was it that those very complex places became these very neat lines, and particularly focusing on the small chapter in which I took part in that process. And so the second part of my presentation will be about that story, which actors have a voice there in this drawing of these ecosystems. And at the end, I'll just leave some reflections about the implications of this story for the actual páramos out there. Páramos are, well, I have to say first that most of the pictures that you will see were taken by the botanists in our team. And that's an important thing, as you will find out later. Páramos are extraordinary places in more than one sense. They frightened conquerors and independence armies for their inaccessibility and their extreme weather conditions. They fascinated explorers and naturalists for their breathtaking landscapes and stunning variety of life forms. Because of extreme weather conditions in Páramos, water is not so readily available as it looks. Páramos are full of lakes and streams, but at night almost all the water in Páramos is frozen, and so most of the water comes from fog and in the air. So plants have developed particular adaptations to be able to access that water. So these are just some of the very particular species that you can find in Páramos that are adapted to this need. And this has made this, and also the fact that Páramos work somehow as islands because they are isolated from each other on the tops of the mountains, has made for an extraordinary richness of life forms. Colombia's already very high species richness, Colombia is one of the countries with more number of species in the world, is proportionally magnified here. In this very small part of the country, Páramos are more or less 3% of the surface of the country. You can find more than 5,400 species of plants, which is a number that probably doesn't mean much, but it's like 3 times the number of vascular plants in Europe. So it's really amazing. And also half of Colombian endemic amphibians, birds, and 2 out of 10 of Colombian mammals are to be found in Páramos, among them the only Andean bear of South America. So, and the highest diversity of Páramos is found precisely in those places where they start to change into lower ecosystems. So the boundary is very complex in itself. Páramos are also big sponges, also because of the low temperature and low oxygen content. Decomposition is a very slow process, so dead leaves and dead plants accumulate, forming soils that are up to 1.5 meters deep, and this gives them the ability also to preserve water and filter it and slowly release it. So again, even though they occupy such a small proportion of the country, more than 70% of Colombian population drinks water from Páramos, and this includes also big agro-industrial activities in the lowlands, rice, sugarcane, and also a big part of Colombia's electric capacity depends on water coming from Páramos. So, of course, this very powerful discourse, or these very powerful facts, or however you want to call them, has made the Colombian state worry about these places or declare protected areas around them. More or less 45% of Páramos are already in some form of public conservation, more or less restrictive of human use. But of course, Páramos, people have also related to Páramos since pre-Columbian times. For indigenous people, Páramos are sacred places, and in their lakes lies the origin of humanity. And today, at least 31 indigenous resguardos, that's collective indigenous territories legally recognized by the state, have territories in Páramos, but most of the people who actually live in Páramos are campesinos who have been arriving in different moments in Colombian history since colonial times until relatively recently, and most of the time displaced by the land grabbing process of the more fertile lower lands. So more or less it's calculated, but this is a very imprecise number. Around 200,000 people actually live in Páramos, and this of course doesn't count all the people that don't live there but use Páramos and depend for their lives for using them. Many Páramo lands are also very fertile for potato and onion growing. Many of these big cultivations are owned by urban, like people who live in cities, and rich people who don't live actually in the territories, but they are very extensive and very intensive in their use of agrochemicals. And today, more or less, I think 32 municipalities in Colombia have more than half of their land inside Páramos. So this means they heavily depend on their use of this land for their economic maintenance. In some Páramos, and this is last but very important, gold and coal mining have been going on also since colonial times. This is the picture of Betas, which in English means seams, because there is a very big and very well-known gold seam going through the mountain. And this village is at 3,200 meters height, and they have been extracting gold since the first conqueror who arrived there was searching for that gold, so it's like a 500 years history of mining. But also recently, many of those traditional mines, or most of them, have been appropriated by international corporations, as has been the case in most Latin American countries. So complex networks are in place that link these traditional miners to those global companies. So yeah, this coincidence of ways of valuing Páramos has resulted in recent years in tensions of different sorts around Páramos, with different ideas. I don't have time here to explain it, but each of these pictures is of a different, like defends a different idea of what Páramos are, or what how they should be preserved. So. And these manifestations have been more or less successful, more or less powerful, but they have been increasing in the last 6 or 7 years in Colombia. So it is in this complex context that the law was issued, according to which mining and agriculture are banned in Páramos, and the Humboldt Institute, where I was working, was commissioned to produce the technical input for this delimitation. So the way, if you remember my question, or my research question for this time at the RCC is, so how did this happen? How this complexity and dynamic become those very flat and neat lines? So the way this, in a simplified way, the way this question tends to be answered is, oh, okay, sorry for that. It's like a relatively simple alliance between the experts and the government and the state, and so experts inform or legitimize the state so that the state can advance its interests in ordering the land. However, according to my experience, this was much more complicated than this simple alliance, and it was one with many different actors, filled with tensions and changes and contradictions, and still, after 1 year of being here, I'm still trying to make sense of what happened in those last 3 years of my life. First, the experts. This is a picture of my research team. Here I am, and these are the people who were coordinating the huge project that was going on all in the country, which at some point had like 30 research groups with which we had signed agreements all over the country, but this was like the central team. It was made up of geographers, cadastral engineers, biologists, anthropologists, ecologists. But we, of course, were only the most recent representatives of a long tradition of natural and social sciences that had taught us particular ways to look at the world. I won't go into details here, but this will be an important part of my work, just to think how these concepts have methods of studying biology in the world, or anthropology, or how they were like adapted and used for this particular situation. But what I want to stress here is that all of us had spent time in our studies, or before this project, or during the project, days, weeks, months in Páramos, walking through their swamps and getting lost in their fog, and talking to their people, and even living in people's houses there. And we had in different ways been changed by Páramos. Also, we were the heirs of 20th century Páramo researchers, some of whose pictures I'm showing you there, who cared for Páramos, who also wrote about Páramos with passion and rigor, and awakened our affect and a sense of urgency in the face of what they felt was the destruction of Páramos. So we were working in the company of those people's voices also, with the responsibility that they had handed down to us. So how did we interpret our task? How come that this group, interdisciplinary group, decided, okay, yeah, let's do maps to simplify the world and to conserve Páramos? No. I think we were very idealistic, and we thought that it was possible to change the ministry's idea of how conservation should be carried out. So, yeah, not such a very realistic idea, but we tried. So what we thought is, okay, we're going to do the maps, but more as a reference for much more detailed studies of social conflicts that are going on in Páramos. So we knew that the maps were needed, but what we tried to do is to make the maps give them a secondary role and invest most of the money of the project and most of our alliances to carry out relatively detailed, although the time was against us, studies of people who are living in Páramos, trying to answer the question that the ministry was not asking, but we tried to make them see that it was an important question. Who and in which ways will be affected by this very black and white conservation idea, but also who will be privileged if you preserve those Páramos, what happens to the water downstream. And at the end of this process, like 1 year ago or so, we handed to the ministry a set of documents, quite detailed, with the maps, with the famous maps, but also with recommendations about how to do more place-based governance and promote agreements with people. And well, it was very detailed, as much as we could with the time that we had. So this was us with all of our company and urgencies and ideas. And what happened to the ministry, on the other hand? This is a picture of Colombia's president, Juan Manuel Santos, and the then Minister of the Environment, and they are signing, they are in a páramo, and they are signing the first legal act for the delimitation of the first páramo that was delimited in the country. Well, not the second one. They had recently, in 2011, the government had issued the National Development Plan of Juan Manuel Santos, who had just recently been elected, and in it the government had made its intentions very clear to give priority to mining as one of what they called development locomotives. They sold their project of government in 4 locomotives that would take the country into the future, and one of them was the mining locomotive. And also, as some of you might know, the peace agreements in Colombia were in the process of being signed, and for their implementation, the government was going to need a lot of money. So, given that in Páramos 2 of the biggest gold reserves in the country and allegedly in the continent were to be found, for at least part of the government, you could say that Páramos were obstacles to access funding for their government plans. So, and as is natural with obstacles, once you accept they have to exist, you want them to be the neater, the clearer, and the smaller possible. You are not interested in understanding their complexities or in thinking about long-term processes of agreements or anything like that. And on top of all this government was in need of a more environmental face after sustained criticisms of its explicit extractivist vocation. So what better than a simple and long-standing indicator such as number of protected areas? And so you just need to show a map and show how much you care for the environment, if you can say that at the end. And actually the president put in his promises of government that in 2 years' time he would have delimited 24 of Colombia's 36 Páramos complexes. He had no idea what he was talking about, of course. So our relation to the ministry was an increasingly troubled one. That alliance was really very complicated because at the same time, the Humboldt Institute gets part of its funding from the ministry. So it's not just a matter of throwing them into the water, so to say. It was much more complicated than that. But apart from the ministry and the experts and all our legacies and urgencies, other actors are also important in this story. I will just mention 2 of them. First, of course, the one that I have already suggested, the mining locomotive going at full speed and lobbying at the highest levels of government in favor of a very quick and very favorable delimitation. But around the advancement of mining, and although it might sound paradoxically, the other actors came on stage, some of them radically fighting mining, but also through their fight contributing to the simplification of Páramos as lines on maps. Among these, radical environmentalism and the press spoke very loudly in favor of conservation of Páramos, understanding conservation as drawing the line. And they called in bold letters on headlines and in street slogans for the deployment of shields to safeguard Páramos. Even Al Gore, in this not very beautiful picture of him, he joined this choir and he was interviewed about Colombia. He visited Colombia, one of the Páramos, and he also talked about how Colombians must decide between gold and water, also simplifying the problem as one of a line. And most of the time, the Humboldt Institute was mentioned as the legitimate expert in charge of drawing that line. So science was called upon as the material with which those shields were to be forged. This is just a quick search of how many times Páramos were mentioned in one of the two main national newspapers. And as you can see, starting in 2011, it had a very important place in the press. But of course, these maps are not just the outcome of negotiations of some powerful people and their alliances and tensions. Páramos themselves and their interactions with us play an important role in this story, as I already suggested, through all our experiences and how we were changed and tied to them in many different ways. But also, to put it simply, no matter how concerned the conservationists were, no matter how much pressure we had to make Páramos bigger, so to say, we could not invent a Páramo at 2,400 meters. And also, on the other hand, no matter how powerful the miners were, we could not just erase the village that was at 3,200 meters. There were I'm not joking, there were actual pressures to just cut that village out because it will take us too much problem to leave them in Páramos. So I will also develop that further in the project, but the Páramos themselves, of course, played an important role here. So up to this point, we have seen some of the characters involved in the emergence of these maps, but whose voices were not included, whose voices are not to be heard when you listen to those maps. So once all our studies had been carried out and handed to the ministry started issuing legal acts for Páramos delimitation. They were based almost solely on the maps, of course, and in many ways against experts' advice. The lines became the only response of the state to a very complex problem. So in a way, those maps as legal references do not include the expert's voice, but in as far as our studies try to make local people's voices heard through the ethnographic work and through all our the work with social actors that we had carried out, people's histories, their own accounts of Páramos, their own maps, their knowledge were also silenced. So in the relationship between the experts and the state, at least from my experience, the state is selectively deaf. And of course, these voices do not include, these maps do not include the non-human beings that could also have been represented there had the experts group been formed in a different way. If, for instance, we had microbiologists in our team, probably we would have counted on different kind of information, or geologists, and these are not like crazy ideas. Probably there should have been, but it's then impossible. How do you decide which experts have a voice in that process? And on the other hand, more than once did mining corporations hire their own teams of scientists to propose their own versions of the maps. Often these maps were more detailed with a lot more of information that we had, and they were better funded, of course, and casually they resulted in significantly smaller Páramos. These miners' voices were also excluded from our process. So I think I ran out of time, maybe.
Well, to keep the time, I was wondering that.
I have 2 more slides. No, 1 more slide. So if we go just going back quickly to the maps, we might see them in a different way now. If you look carefully, maybe you can see them a particular constellation of power relations between experts, their knowledge, their tool, or our knowledge, our tools, our affects, but also the state, global networks, nature. And what about the consequences? Just to say quickly, of course, despite all that I've said against simplifying the complexity into lines, today these maps are being used as references for giving permits to legal mining. So in a way they are working as shields against big scale mining in Páramos. But of course, on the other hand, these maps can, at least in principle, and that's something that I think is very interesting to discuss, the distance between the law and what happens in practice. They can also be used against any other form of human use of Páramos. Traditional agriculture, local associations of organized farmers, the diverse meanings that come with that, the very networks that have allowed Páramos to persist in many cases could be under threat with the legal delimitation. So, as could be said of any weapon, while these polygons safeguard Páramos against legal mining, they can also be dangerous weapons against the very things that they are supposed to protect. Thank you.